Welcome back, everybody, from me, Tim Cable, to Talking Sportsbooks. And coming up, award-winning journalist and writer Don Stradley joins me as we talk about the Immortals of American Boxing, which is the title of his new book. Now, just a reminder, you can catch up with all of the previous editions of the show in either audio or a selection out in video format over on the website at www.talkingsportsbooks.com or across any of the streaming providers. Now, boxing continues to provide us with a rich source of fine sporting literature. If you missed the show with Donald McRae recently talking about his final book on boxing, The Last Bell, Life, Death and Boxing, then you can now watch the full video edition of this over on the website. Also, Steve Hunt joined us earlier this year to talk about heavyweight title fights from the 1980s. In fact, all of the heavyweight title fights of the 1980s, which brought back plenty of memories, especially if you thought that that era was defined only by Mike Tyson and perhaps the end of the reign of Larry Holmes. And just out now is Steve Bunce's book, Around the World in 80 Fights. This is now available in paperback format. And here's a clip from that feature we did with Steve a while back, looking back at the great Joe Bugner, who we sadly lost recently. But, you know, if you go back and look at the story about him with his mother walking across
escaping from Hungary,
in Hungary, that was an incredible story. But he was far from finished. This was at the time, wasn't it? Frank Warren had started promoting fights on ITV, and the big draw was Bugner.
It was Bugner.
And if you look at who he'd beaten on the way in there, Greg Page, David Bay, James Quick Tillis was
the
there.
Cowboy.
I mean, he was far from washed up.
And it was, again, we did that thing earlier where we talked about Sugar Ray Leonard being 34. I mean, off the top of my head, and I haven't got the book in front of me, let's say Bugner was 35 or something, or 36. It wasn't like he was even in his 40s. There was plenty left in Big Joe, trust me. And, and he carried on fighting for a million trillion years after, which he really did. But you're right, you mentioned there about how badly observed Joe Bugner is, which is a disgrace because I think he's one of the greatest British heavyweights of all time. And one of the big defenders of Joe Bugner, and it's the stuff that you don't ever see in the clips, is when Parkinson had his show and Ali appeared on it. There's all the knockabout stuff, with all the sort, all the knockabout stuff.
Yeah, absolutely.
But some of the more personal stuff, and you can watch it, and I was really tempted to put some of it in the book, is Ali defending Bugner to Parky, who did not like Joe Bugner. Some of the big writers at the time, Hugh McIlvenney, they did not like Joe Bugner. They considered Joe Bugner a bit brash and a bit arrogant. He was a kind of trash talker, Joe Bugner, before trash talking was allowed. He was allowed if you were an American heavyweight, but it wasn't allowed if you were a big lump from Bedford who'd been carried over the Alps by his mother. So carried over, not the Alps, that's me ripping the proverbial out of it. Carried out of Hungary, being chased by the Russians in 1956 or whenever the Hungarian uprising was. He wasn't meant to be mouthy. He wasn't meant to be confident. He wasn't meant to talk about how he beat Muhammad Ali. He played the game, Joe, but he upset a lot of the British press and they created this whole thing. If you actually look at Joe Bugner's entire record, I don't mean it's staggering. I mean, I make really bold claims for Joe Bugner. I'm not having him at the end of my top 10. I'm having him really high in my top 5, mate. I'm telling you. And I've always been a Joe Bugner fan. I remember growing up in my house, my dad being really frustrated when he'd hear Harry Carpenter talking about Joe. He was no fan of Bugner, about how Joe Bugner couldn't really punch. And I remember my dad explaining to me when I was young, saying, listen, if you're 16 stone and you hit a man anywhere, you're going to hurt him. All this no punch, this is it's a joke. It doesn't exist. He wouldn't have said fallacy. He wouldn't have used that word. It's a fallacy. It's a complete joke. There are men that hit you and you go to sleep, and there are men that hit you and you remain hit, but you always know you've been hit. It's that simple. And Joe Bugner, well, I tell you, Joe Bugner, with that ridiculous blonde hair, friends with Tom Jones, the body he's got now, boy, oh boy, we think Jake Paul earns a few quid. Joe Bugner be out earning all of them.
Yeah, you obviously know this, but I only uncovered these stories about Bugner while I was looking up details of this book about how he was on the Hollywood A-list for parties. He fell out with Elvis Presley.
Oh, he swore at Elvis, told Elvis to stuff it.
Yeah.
In no uncertain terms.
Well, Don Stradley spent the last decades writing about boxing, and you might remember that he came on the show a couple of years back to talk about the book, The Fight, the story behind the legendary meeting between Marvin Hagler and Thomas Hearns. Well, now he has returned. He is back, and the remit is wide, to say the least. All he had to do was, well, it was quite simple, really. Put together a book highlighting the Immortals of American Boxing. And if you think that was an easy assignment, think again. This book isn't just a collection of famous names who won a title or two. This is a collection of those who transcended the sport of boxing. It's nice to finally see you, Don. And in the background, a whole load of books. And we're here to talk about the one that you've got in your hand there. Let's have a look. There it is. The Immortals of American Boxing. I had a great time going through this, by the way. So tell me, when you sit down to write a book like this, how do you set out the criteria for who is going to make it in the book? Because it's not simply about he won a world title.
Yeah, it was an interesting process. Once I decided what to do, it wasn't hard at all. Basically, a publisher, Yeldon Street Press, contacted me and said that they had done a series of books they had done Immortals of Rugby, they had done Immortals of Horse Racing, they had done a lot of books in this Immortals series. And they were an Australian.
Yeah, I had a look through a few of their books, actually.
And they were invited by an American distributor, Simon & Schuster.
Yep.
Simon & Schuster made them an offer. Do some American sports, and we'll promote you in America. So one of the sports they chose was good old boxing. And one of the people at Gelding Street Press knew me from previous books and had heard me on a podcast, maybe yours. And they contacted me, and they made the proposal. They gave me the title and a vague idea of what they wanted. They sent me, I think, the Immortals of Surfing. They said, look at this book and see if you can do something similar about boxing. So like you said, I was not just going to pick guys who had a good left jab or guys, or the 20 best knockout artists. I didn't want to do that. I thought there had been enough books of that type.
Yeah.
So I had a short list of boxes to tick, One was they had to transcend the sport in some way. Mm-hmm. It wasn't enough to be a featherweight champion. You had to be a featherweight champion who either, like Willie Pep, who I included in the book, had this phenomenal record of 200 or so fights, and he was in a plane crash, and they thought he was never going to fight again, but he, had a long career after that. And he was a household name. That became a big factor in writing the book, is that there was a period of time in America where if you were the champion of the heavyweights or the middleweights, if you were a well-respected champion, everybody knew you.
Sure.
You were not just in the realm of boxing. You were a household name. You could walk down any street and ask somebody, who's the middleweight champion? And they would say, Sugar Ray Robinson. They knew. The names had an impact. That it's less so today.
Oh, and some. Yeah.
As great as Terrence Crawford is,
yeah,
I could walk down any street in my neighborhood and not find anyone who has ever heard of him.
Yeah, it's true.
Something has changed, and we could have an entire podcast just about that.
Well, I picked 3 fighters out here to talk about. I mean, you could talk forever, but what I also like about these books, and this book in particular, is that, there's this mystique, because we're going back to a time when there is, in many cases, little or no film or footage of some of these guys. And we get a snapshot, not only of the time in boxing, but socially and culturally as well. And out of these 3 fighters I picked, the first was a fighter who the great Ray Arcel believed to be one of the greatest, certainly the greatest he ever trained. And he trained Kid Gavilan, Henry Armstrong, Ezard Charles, Roberto Duran. And this was the ghetto wizard, Benny Leonard.
Yeah, Benny Leonard was a fascinating character, and apparently was a wizard in the ring. Just the whole concept of hitting and not getting hit. It was I think I introduced him in the book by saying, boxing is not an art, but if you saw him, you thought you were watching an artist at work. That was really stylish. He was. And also what was interesting to me was that he had a bit of a dark side. He hung out with some gamblers, and he would play right? And he was so good that sometimes he had to promise the opponent, I won't hurt you too badly tonight. And that was the only way he could get opponents to agree to step in the
fight him.
He was that good. And he would tell them, I'm not going to mess you up too much.
He came from the Jewish ghettos down on the Lower East Side. And if you want a handle on what life was like then, bizarrely, I just happened to be watching the other night that great Sergio Leone classic, Once Upon a Time in America. And you can literally, I mean, I'd already read the piece on him there, and I'm thinking, God, you can just imagine him down here rolling a couple of drunks at a bar and, eating down at Fat Mo's.
Yeah, it was a rough neighborhood. I think I mentioned in the chapter that if there was some kind of gang warfare going on in another part of the city, they would dump the bodies in that neighborhood because it was nothing new. It was, here's another dead body for you. And investigators would just assume it was, something that had happened in that neighborhood that night, It was a rough area. And I think his family tried to keep him apart as much as they could. But he was attracted to the allure of boxing and gamblers, and he fought under a different name so his mother wouldn't realize he was boxing.
This was great. This is a great story. It was Liner, wasn't it? His Liner, rather, his real name. Was it a there was a story or two about it. One was that the ring announcer couldn't pronounce Benjamin Liner, so he changed it. And the other one was, like you said, he didn't want his mother to find out. But the great story there was him coming home one night and they found out, and the mother is crying and the father's shouting, and he takes out $5 and puts it down, and his father puts an arm around his shoulder and says, "Well, son, when are you fighting next?"
Everybody loves a winner. Even if you don't like what they're doing, if they're winning, you get on their side. And he won for a long time, a lot of years.
And again, at this time, the number of boxers, the number of fighters who used to lie about their age. I mean, his debut, he was 15. And he didn't have a great start. He lost 4 fights in his first year. But as you said, from 1917 to 1925, 7 years and 7 months, he held the lightweight title. And it's like you said, an artist at work. And another great line I think I picked up out of the book, his left jab was like a fencer with a foil. I mean...
Yeah. There was a legend that he used to spar with 2 guys at the same time. Now, I don't know if there's any truth in it, or if it's just folklore that was passed down through the years. But yeah, with that left hand, he could box 2 guys, keep them off, and his footwork was impeccable. And I think that's something that has been lost over the years with fighters is footwork. They're not quite as nimble as they once were. If you ever see footage of Willie Pep or Ray Robinson, that class of fighter, there was a nimbleness to them that was really eye-catching. Now they're much more flat-footed, and there are probably reasons for that, changes in training, changes in methodology.
Yeah.
Maybe the influence of Mexican fighters who, for the most part, are flat-footed and like to dig in, to leverage. And there are more Mexican trainers now after that influx of Mexican fighters. But back in the 20s and 30s and 40s, that top echelon of fighters, very nimble. You don't see that as much anymore.
Tell me, you don't also see, what was it he used to do in between rounds with his hair?
Oh, yeah. Well, Arcel would do that for him, too. Arcel would hold his hair back, make sure he always looked immaculate, like nothing was bothering him, And after the fight, Leonard, it was like this victory pose where he just looked at the audience and kind of hair back,
I love it.
as if to say, no problem, nothing bothers me, and it was like kind of a victory sign, He was an interesting character, and he was a household name. And if you, when you read articles by Bud Schulberg or other Jewish sports writers from that period, they can't praise him enough. What he meant to the Jewish population, particularly in the cities. because I think Bud Schulberg said something to the degree of, no matter what was happening to us on the streets or in business or at school, things were going against us. We always had Benny Leonard to look at.
Wasn't all glory, though, was it? Because he was involved in one of the great controversies with that fight with Jack Britton for the welterweight title. Beaten him prior, yet here he puts him down, and then for some bizarre reason, he hits him when he's down, and it's an immediate disqualification. And it was a quarter of a century later, wasn't it? It was his trainer at the time, who was still alive, a guy called Manny Seaman, who said it was all prearranged.
Yeah. And I think I mentioned in the book that you can't take everything Manny Seaman says totally seriously. But it wouldn't surprise me. Because, like I said, Benny Leonard had some friends in low places. I
like that. Low life in high places.
Yeah, he wasn't above gambling a little bit. And when you think about it, what would the welterweight title have really meant to him? He'd been the lightweight champion for a long time. At that point, winning another belt was not that big a deal to him. Sure. Now people want to win a belt every month, and they're constantly changing weight classes and trying to, win as much hardware as possible. But back then, it was not that big a deal. Some people did it, some didn't. Back then, if you only ruled over one weight class, you were considered, the king of that weight class. No one expected you to jump up to welterweight. It was almost a novelty at the time. So it wouldn't surprise me if he just thought, all right, we'll let Jack Britton keep his title, and I'll make a few bucks on the side.
Well, he lost it all, didn't he? Or the majority of it in the stock market, crash in the Great Depression. But he came back in his mid-30s. He had 22 more fights, and he still only lost one of them. And if you look at his career overall, of the 6 losses, 4 were in the first year, plus the final one. I mean, it's still a mighty impressive career.
Oh, yeah. And also, what interested me, and you probably saw it in that chapter, was back then there was that concept of the no decision bout.
Yes, yeah, because boxing was illegal still in places.
In a lot of states in America, boxing was illegal. So you could only fight in certain states if you had a membership in an athletic club. And, sometimes they would waive that just to bring in somebody like Benny Leonard and give him like an instant membership, and the fight would not really count on the record.
Yeah, sure.
But the newspaper men would write in their columns, I think Benny Leonard dominated this fight. So they sometimes called it a newspaper decision or a no decision, And trying to explain that to modern fans is really like talking to a wall. It's very hard to get them to understand that,
Well, try and explain to them how a guy that loved the sport so much gave up his life in the ring and then became a referee, 120 bouts. He was in the Merchant Marines as well. Obviously, there was the war in between that. And literally, I mean, his last act was in a boxing ring because he was, 47, it was 1947 rather, a place called the St. Nicholas Arena, where he died of a heart attack.
Yeah.
I mean, real tragedy.
And they took his body into the dressing room and, of this damp little arena. And that was where one of the great fighters of all time spent final moments, was, lying on a stretcher in St. Nicholas Arena, where he had fought, quite a few times. It was a sad end. He was a young man.
Well, moving on then to the second of the three that I picked out, and the man that's still, I think, widely regarded, maybe in the trade, perhaps, not amongst everybody, but in the trade. Walker Smith Jr., a.k.a. Sugar Ray Robinson, who was moving around a lot as a kid, trying to find family roots and whatever, ended up living in Harlem. And you talked about footwork and how we don't see an awful lot of this great footwork. Yeah, it's a brilliant photograph. There's some great photography in this book, by the way. It really is some great stuff.
Here he is with Jake LaMotta, the Raging Bull.
Well, what can you say about that? But you go back to his footwork. It's the thought of him as a kid tap dancing outside the Broadway theaters, trying to make some money. And, this guy, he idolized Joe Louis as well. And, it seemed early on he was destined for a career in the ring.
Yeah, Sugar Ray Robinson is a character who some people have tried to write books about him, but you can't get it all in 100 pages. It was such a magnificent, rich life, full of stories, full of events, full of controversy. Ray Robinson was even the word legend is not big enough. He was really all encompassing, and he was so good, but there's almost no film footage of him.
Yeah, it's incredible.
As a welterweight, when he was lightning fast and, so good that he had to go up to middleweight to fight LaMotta just to kill some time. while the middleweight champion, the welterweight champion, Freddie Cochran, was in the war. He was doing military service. So the welterweight title was kind of frozen. Robinson had nothing to do. He'd beaten up all the welterweights. So he went up to middleweight and fought Jake LaMotta. And it's so interesting to me that when they first fought, I think LaMotta was 20 and Robinson was maybe 21. And you can't think of them as that young. They were really boys almost, at that age.
It's incredible.
Yeah.
If a career is to be defined by an opponent, then it has to be that rivalry with, the Raging Bull, LaMotta, the boxer against the brawler. You had the Olympic Stadium epic. Then there was, that was in October of 42. Then they had the rubber series because they'd already met once and it was 1-1. And it was set for weeks later, not like months later or next year, 3 weeks later. And in between that 3-week wait, Ray Robinson goes back in and fights the Olympic silver medalist just to keep himself in condition. It was a guy called Jackie Wilson.
Oh, yeah. Back at that time, you fought constantly because you weren't making millions of dollars with each fight. You might get a few $1,000s here and there, and maybe $20,000 for a really big event. So they were fighting once or twice a month.
It's incredible.
Robinson was interesting too because, like a lot of fighters in the book, and I only discovered this as I was writing, almost all of them, the main 15, they take a break from boxing for some reason or other. Sometimes they go to prison, as happened with Mike Tyson. Sometimes, like with Muhammad Ali, there was the incident with the draft board.
Yeah.
That saw him get stripped of his boxing license. Ray Robinson left boxing for a couple of years because he thought he was going to go into show business and sing and dance. And as good as he was tap dancing outside of stores in Harlem, the public really wasn't in love with him as a tap dancer, but he was gone for a few years. And then when he came back, he had slipped a little bit. He was not quite as dynamic, not quite as quick. and he still won the middleweight title. I think 3 or 4 more times.
That's that St. Valentine's Day Massacre, the last of the 6 meetings with LaMotta, was summed up by LaMotta. He said it was as bad a beating as I ever took, but I wouldn't give him the satisfaction of letting him put me down. Incredible. I mean, and you can see that fight because I was going back to watch bits of that, and there's some really good footage of it.
Yeah, it is. It's almost scary looking at, because at one point around the 10th or 12th round, LaMotta is really just standing up like a ghost. The life has been beaten out of him, but he just keeps coming forward like a ghost who doesn't know it's over. He's.
One of your quotes was in there from him in the book was, "I fought like I didn't want to live." Yeah,
he was a psychological study, that's for sure. But, they fought 6 times.
It's incredible.
Even though in the record books it says, Robinson won 5 of the 6, so it makes it seem like Robinson was well ahead. Each of the fights was close.
Yeah.
And there were a couple of times where Robinson won the decision and the audience booed, thinking that LaMotta had deserved it. So out of those 6 fights, they were all very close. There was one where Robinson won a decision, but LaMotta knocked him down in one of the middle rounds. So they were never easy fights. And it was only really until the last one that it didn't go the distance.
I did see some training footage. I found a very grainy 2.5-minute video of him doing road work and skipping. The skipping was just incredible. Even today, when you look at fighters training, whatever, he was so light. He was so nimble. One of them saw him doing the rope work with the backing of a jazz band. Yeah, that's it. That's the one. That is epic. Well, that's just fantastic. You've got a complete full-on brass band there. But he was the one that loved an entourage, didn't he? Because his life outside the ring, when you said they transcend the sport, this guy did exactly that.
Oh, yeah. And he owned a couple of city blocks in Harlem during the late 40s and early 50s. And, sadly, he ended up having to sell most of his properties. But at one point, he owned a restaurant, he owned a nightclub, he owned a bakery, he owned a flower shop, he owned the whole block. And he liked hobnobbing in Hollywood. He took some bit parts in movies when it came up. He was...
and the pink Cadillac.
The pink Cadillac. I don't even know if it's pink. It's a color that you don't see. Sometimes it's described as fuchsia.
Yeah, that's right.
It's like this gooey pink. It's pink plus.
At the Entourage, I did find a piece on the Entourage, and in the Entourage was the barber, the chauffeur, and a dwarf. He had a dwarf. God knows what the dwarf was for. And there was somebody to just walk alongside them, whistling Sweet Georgia Brown.
Yeah. In a way, you could see Robinson getting a little indulgent.
I loved it.
I have to hire my own whistler.
But while he's doing that, we talked about the LaMotta and the 6 fights there. And the fact that was on television and people weren't quite used to seeing that brutality played out in front of them. But as Robinson was celebrating and driving the fuchsia Cadillac and going down to Sugar Ray's club, or buying the wife the lingerie store, LaMotta's wife said after the final time he was never the same again. Physically or psychologically, it absolutely destroyed him.
Yeah, I think LaMotta only had a few more fights after that. Not a lot. But Robinson was a shrewd businessman too. He was one of the first guys to say, "I want a cut of the TV percentages. I want a cut of the radio. I want the attendance. I want a cut of that." He was what they call a ball buster. And a lot of people in the business didn't like him, and he was very vindictive. If there were certain sports columnists who didn't like him or had said things about him that he could be very vindictive. And there was a great quote. I don't know if I put it in here, but there was this sports writer who was very frustrated and just sitting at maybe it was after a fight, he was sitting there drinking a beer and he just looked unhappy. And another sports writer said, "What's going on? You look a little upset." And he says, "It's that damn Robinson. I was getting ready to really bomb him in an article today." And then the next thing I hear, he's at a children's hospital giving out candy and turkeys and signing autographs for everybody. It's like he knows what I'm thinking, and he's always one step ahead of me.
Brilliant.
I'm getting ready to crush him in my column, and then he goes out and does some charitable work that will make me look bad.
But he went on, he went on too long, as they all do. He went on till the mid-1960s, and in his final year, this again is incredible. He's 44 years of age, and he fought 17 times.
Oh, can you imagine that?
No. So it's no surprise then when you see him. I mean, it is light-handed in tragedy, obviously, because he was broke, divorced, and of course he was suffering from Alzheimer's, and he was a diabetic and dead at 67.
Yeah. And that was another through line in the book, is that a lot of the fighters that I picked, they stayed in the game too long, and they all died kind of young.
Tragic, yeah.
Yeah. LaMotta, of course, lived to be 95 or something. So there's always the exception to the rule. But a lot of those guys, they came to unpleasant ends.
It's interesting that Ali called him the king, didn't he? The king, my idol, Ray Robinson.
Oh, yeah. Ali greatly admired Robinson. You can see a little bit of Robinson's style, sort of transposed into Ali's much bigger body. I think Robinson was a little more bloodthirsty. I don't think Ali really liked hurting a guy too badly unless he really had to. Whereas with Robinson, I think Robinson liked knocking a guy out. I enjoyed that. He liked to land that perfect shot. He took a little pride in that.
Last guy then. And it is ironic because the more glorious the triumphs, the more tragic the ending. Benny Leonard died of that heart attack on site. Sugar Ray beset with illness. And lastly, the last guy I want to talk about was the Brockton blockbuster, Rocky Marciano, described by one. He's got short arms, thick legs, and the demeanor of a bored doorman at a New York nightclub.
Yeah. I used to have conversations with the late Lou Duva.
Ah, yeah, great guy.
If you remember Lou, and he told me a story about when Marciano was first invited to go train in New York, up in the Lakes region, and he had his little Jewish trainer was going to introduce him to the boxing world,
Charlie Goodman.
Yeah, Goldman. Yeah,
Goldman. Sorry.
Yeah. Goldman invited people, and Lou Duva was a young guy at that time, starting out in the business, but he got word that Goldman had this new heavyweight that he was working with, and Duva says, we went up there and we saw that guy, and he looked ridiculous. You know, he was clumsy. His arms were too short. And he just seemed kind of small and slow. And then he hit his opponent. He hit his sparring partner. And he says he hit that guy, and the guy spun around the ring like a top. You know, and we thought, that's why Goldman picked him up. Okay, all right. The guy has some kind of, almost like a magical punch. It was nothing that you could really teach a guy. It was just an instinct. I think there was something about the way his shoulders were made.
It's the Susie Q, isn't it? It's the Susie Q. There are people that go into all sorts of scientific discussion about exactly what angle the arm has to be, how where you're positioned.
Well, what I've always noticed, and I don't think anyone else has ever said this, so this could be mine. Rocky Marciano loved baseball.
Yeah, well, he tried out, didn't he?
And he tried out for the Chicago Cubs. He loved baseball. And there are pictures of him. I won't model for you, but there are pictures of him throwing the right uppercut, and it really looks the same motion as when you're swinging a bat. And so I always wondered, was there some kind of strength he developed as a kid swinging the bat that when he threw the right uppercut, it kind of carried over from one sport to the next? It is kind of like muscle memory, as some people will call it. But you could take a picture of a baseball player swinging and put it over a picture of Marciano throwing the right uppercut, and the motion is very similar. And I'm thinking that maybe that's where you got the leverage, because when you're swinging the bat, you use your legs for leverage. Maybe things he had been taught carried over. Now, I've never heard anyone say that. It's all mine. But I think there might be something to it.
Well, the power was visible for the first time against Carmine Bingo, wasn't it? The second fight where he ended up putting him in hospital, and the guy was suffering a brain injury. But following on from that, the press got a picture of Marciano in a church, said to be praying at the time for him. I mean, PR like that, you couldn't buy, and it wasn't planned, it wasn't pre-planned or anything like this. So they say.
Yeah, it is a great picture, and it appears in some old area newspapers of a very almost angelic looking Marciano at the church pew, like this, and he looks like an innocent boy, of course, with the power of a tank, so people liked that combination of innocence and almost murderous power, and now I've talked to people who knew him, and they all say he was a sweet guy, nice guy, but I think he liked putting people out too. I think
the discipline in his life was extreme, Spartan. This existence, 7 days a week, training, ending with sessions in the pool at the end of the day, in bed usually by 9 in the evening. Little or no social presence, little or no life outside of the ring.
Yeah, and I think that's why he retired earlier than some people might have. I think he was just, I've had enough. I want to go out and party a little bit and spend some of my money if possible, though I've heard he was also very tight with the dollar. But I think all that discipline, it reached a point where he was only, I think, 32 or 33 when he retired. He was very young. And it was because of that. He just couldn't do it again. Not another fight where I have to hole up like a monk and hide from the world and beat my brains out in sparring and
It wasn't like his opponents, though, didn't know what to expect, because he was always very open, and you'll see interviews with him and he'll say, I have one style I get low, become a small target, bob and weave, stay close, get them on the ropes. That's it. That was it.
Yeah.
And it never deviated.
I think he did get a little more sophisticated in his last few fights than if you see him in his very early fights that are available. He was a little more tucked in, a little more precise, not going for just one haymaker of a punch. He was trying to set things up a little better. I think he did get a little more sophisticated by the end. But there was one interesting quote that I found, and I think I'm sure I included it in his chapter, where there was a rumor that Goldman had told him, "You've reached your peak. You're not going to get any better than you are right now. In fact, you may start to go down a little bit."
Sure.
Goldman said, "I'm watching you train. I'm watching you in the gym. I'm seeing what happens. You're at your peak. It's not going to get better." And I think Marciano never wanted to lose. Once he was, at that state, much like Floyd Mayweather was years later.
Yeah.
When you're accustomed to not losing, the thought of it starts to weigh on you. And there was that rumor that Goldman had told him, you're at your best. You're not going to get better. You may start to slip. I think Rocky took that to heart. He also didn't like his manager, Al Weil. He didn't like his manager. There were a lot of issues, so that was part of it too.
Archie Moore summed him up. He fought him, obviously. He said, you felt like somebody had been beating your body with a blackjack or hitting you with bricks for, the best part of 45 minutes. Oh, yeah. It was that bad.
And, if a couple of punches went low, Rocky would just say, "Hey, it's
the way it is.
Boxing,
His image, though, outside of the ring, this clean-cut image, he was in the services, he did everything right. He was hugely popular. The tales in the book, about the numbers of people that came out, 25,000 came out on one of the victory parades, which was more than they had on VJ Day, and another pulling close to 100,000. So he's pulling more people to his celebrations than either of the presidential visits by Truman and Roosevelt.
Yeah, it was really it's a touching story in a way. The relationship that Marciano had with the city of Brockton, and I lived in Brockton for a couple of years when I was younger, and people were still talking about him, and I got to know the Petronelli brothers.
Hagler's trainers.
Yeah, they were. Goody Petronelli had been Hagler's trainer, and at one point, Marciano was going to invest in their gym. So it was going to be, they were going to call it Rocky Marciano's gym, and the Petronellis were going to run it. But Rocky died in a plane crash, so the Petronellis had to go it alone without, that big name that they could put up front.
Yeah, sure.
But, Goody Petronelli, at the time I know him, I think he was about 80, and he was still talking about Rocky the way a little kid would, just as an idol, and I would say, do you think any of today's guys could have handled him? What do you think, Goody? And he'd say, "Are you kidding? Rocky was made out of concrete." They love that guy.
The most bizarre thing happened, though, didn't it, with him? He took part in this thing called Project Ali, the computer simulation where they sparred around, 70-odd rounds each inside some whereas in Miami, and then it's all stitched together to make it look like a real fight. Yeah. And considering they didn't have CGI or anything like that, what they did was pretty amazing. In fact, it was so good that people actually thought it was a real fight.
And when they had it ready to show to the public, they showed it in movie theaters.
Yeah.
Of the country. And we just interrupt with a great picture of The Rock.
It is a great shot.
Jersey Walcott didn't stand a chance. Beautiful shot. That computer fight, it's gone down in some kind of infamy. And funny story that I think for the anniversary of the computer fight, like maybe the 30th anniversary or what was it, 69?
Yeah.
Maybe it was the 40th anniversary. I can't remember, but they had a special screening of it in Boston, and I went. I was writing for the Ring magazine, and they said, "Why don't you go to this and just write a little update on, write a little review of the night and see how it goes." So I dropped in. It was playing at a small, some kind of not a restaurant, but like a hotel that had a theater, and it could show a movie, that kind of thing. And I went, and what was funny was that as I looked around, there were members of Marciano's family everywhere.
Really?
And they all look like him. Okay? So imagine being in a darkened theater and the lights come up and everywhere you look is Marciano. Somebody with Marciano's face, everywhere you look. Young, big, tall guys, little, short guys, women, but they all had that Marciano face. It was very funny. Very much.
The irony is he never got to see it, did he? Because the plane crash happened and he died before he saw it.
Like weeks, just a couple of weeks.
Yeah.
And
that has kept the conspiracy theorists active for, 4 decades now? Who was in the plane, the links to, mobsters, alien. He was big into aliens as well, wasn't he?
hiding his money underground in Brockton's sewer system. There's all kinds of strange stories. I wish one of them could be true. Just one of them. The funny thing about the computer fight was that at one point they considered having 2 endings. I don't know if you ever heard about that.
No.
In areas where the population was mostly African American, they were going to end it with Ali winning. And then in areas where the audience would be predominantly white, they were going to have Marciano win. And I've heard that that's not true. But that was a rumor that I believed for a long time, but I've heard that it's not true. That the winning scene with Marciano dropping Ali to his knees, and I think Ali is counted out on his knees.
Yeah.
And I always thought it was amusing. I never put much stock in it, but I thought it was amusing.
Well, there you go. Those are the 3 that I mean, I could have done it with any of the others.
Oh, yeah.
But the selection was great. And you do have a chapter at the end where you get in the honorary mentions. Yeah. And again, you can tell when people put together things like this, there's degrees of thought that have gone into it because, Joe Gans is in there, the first American-born black champion. And there's lots of people in there you think, all right, I didn't know anything about him. Just go off and, do a bit of research, find out something about him. But then there are obviously people like Larry Holmes didn't quite make it. Evander Holyfield didn't make it. The one who I imagine would be really pissed off that he didn't make it. And if he's looking down now, he will be significantly pissed off because it would be Marvin Hagler because he isn't in it and Sugar Ray Leonard is.
Yeah. Well, that became the hard part because someone like Ezzard Charles, for instance, a brilliant fighter, who he had 3 victories over Archie Moore. Okay? But yet, Archie Moore is one of the Immortals. And Ezra Charles gets an honorable mention. And now people might say, well, how do you figure that? You know? And a lot of it has to do with just that recognition, that factor, the charisma factor. You know, Archie Moore was
absolutely
larger than life. You know, Archie was a character that, you know, reporters flocked around him because he was always a good story. Whereas Ezzard was a kind of a quiet guy who always kept to himself, you know. Now, if I was just writing about the most skillful fighters, instead of, you know, the Immortals, if I was writing about just skillful fighters, it would have been a different list, you know.
Well, that'll be next year's book.
Well, some people are going to say, you know, where's Roy Jones? Why Roy Jones? Why isn't Oscar De La Hoya going to, you know?
But Roy Jones has got a great story, though, as well, hasn't he? I mean, when you go back to how his life was growing up with his father, who was the Marine, and the discipline in the house. And
you know, Tim, if Roy had retired after he beat Ruiz, okay, if he said, all right, I just won a heavyweight title, you know, goodbye, everybody, I'm going to retire. If he had retired then, he might have worked his way into an honorable mention here.
Yeah, sure.
And it's unfair, but every time I think of Roy Jones, I think of him just on his back. You know. So
last thing then, who was the greatest for you?
Oh, my particular favorite of all.
Yeah.
Because I rarely go for I rarely get into that argument of who's greater than who or who.
No, it's a personal thing.
Of my favorites, I'm really fascinated by the first guy in the book, John L. Sullivan.
Right.
Because America was such a new country, you know, and the technology of the telegraph was a new development. And all of those things sort of coincided, and the Irish were really being stepped on in America, being kicked around. And Sullivan kind of emerged out of all this as a kind of beacon for that time, you know. And I'm not saying he was the greatest fighter or the best fighter or the nicest guy, but there's something about him that fascinates me. It was almost like he came out of the American imagination, almost as if we had all gathered together to create this guy in our minds. And he kind of materialized as a bare-knuckle boxer. You know, at the time the sport was changing. And they were starting to use gloves. So Sullivan's very interesting to me because he bridges that gap between when boxing was an outlawed sport, fought without gloves, to a time when they adopted the Queensberry rules. They started fighting in nicer venues, and it became almost a posh kind of thing, all because of Sullivan. You know, I like that.
Don Stradley's book, Immortals of American Boxing, is out now. And that is it for this edition. Coming up next time, David Goldblatt will join me to talk about his book, Injury Time. And in the meantime, check out the website, which includes video content and all of the previous editions of the show. Simply go to www.talkingsportsbooks.com. And, of course, you can find the show on all of the streaming providers. That is it then from me, Tim Capel. Until next time, thank you very much for watching and listening. For the moment, though, bye-bye for now.